Hello and welcome back to From the Nosebleeds podcast brought to you by myself and Jacob Wetzel. We're back after a little delay from the holidays, and we're back here to give you a couple previews. First, we're going to preview the national championship game coming Monday, possibly could be delayed. There's some reports of COVID cases within Ohio State. They could push the game back. But we've got our two teams now. We've got Ohio State and we've got Alabama. Pretty much everyone expected Alabama to win. And Ohio State came out and had a very good showing against Clemson. So, Wetzel, I just want to get your thoughts on the two semifinal matches real quick.
I came away, I think, more impressed with Notre Dame than I thought I was going to be. I think Notre Dame did a really good job sticking with Alabama towards the end there. I mean, they held them to below their per game average. They held them to 31 points, including 10 in the second half. It really kind of was like after they got to that second half, their defense really started to kind of hold Alabama to a lot of minimal big plays and minimal gains. So I really came away kind of more impressed with Notre Dame. I think Notre Dame really showed people that they deserved that number 4 spot. And it could be part just Alabama not wanting to put too much out there on tape, but the SEC doesn't play defense. I think we all know that by now. But second game, Ohio State, Clemson. I think this was. I think I came away twofold. Number one, I think I came away really kind of questioning Clemson's defense. Like I know their defense, when everyone was healthy, played really well this year at a lot of games. Their defense was fully healthy, and they gave up 14 points in the first quarter, 21 points in the second quarter. Like that's pretty much Ohio State scoring on every single drive they had, and I was really impressed with Ohio State. I think that you're seeing Trey Sermon have another Ezekiel Elliott type performance. So came away really I think convincing that Notre Dame was the 4th spot, and I think I came away kind of thinking Ohio State, after all the talk about the 6 games and everything, deserved to be in there and more than maybe even some people were giving, like some of the other ranked teams a chance.
Yeah, so I'll hit on the 2 games too. I also came away a little more impressed with Notre Dame. I mean, I've been talking about Notre Dame's defense almost all year and that they deserve more respect. This is actually the fewest points Bama scored in a game since like 2017. So, I mean, you go back 3 years now, and this is the fewest amount of points they scored. You can say they gave up, whatever. The rest of their starters, they didn't rest their starters. They were still in there. They were still playing. So I don't think it was necessarily that they, let off the gas. I think, yes, maybe they let off the gas a little, but I also think, I mean, they still had their starters out there the full time. And, Saban, any chance he gets to step on somebody's throat, he tries to take advantage of that, historically. So I don't think it was
Mm-hmm.
necessarily too much of Bama letting up. I think it's just, again, Notre Dame had a very good defense all year. Alabama, we know what they are. It'll be interesting to see how Sark coaches this next game, because the last time Alabama had offensive coordinator leave was Lane Kiffin, if you remember, and he coached the title game as well. And a lot of people were not too happy with him after that title game. Felt like they should have ran the ball more with Bo Scarborough. I don't know if I said that right. And Derrick Henry in that Clemson game that they lost. They were very upset with his coaching in that game. It'll be interesting to see how Sark coaches and his game plan. As for the other side, Clemson and Ohio State, excuse me. We talked about earlier this year how Ohio State probably had some issues at the offensive line, and they didn't have any real playmakers on the front 7. I think what we didn't talk about enough or didn't focus on enough with Clemson is how poor their offensive line was this year and how poor their defensive line, not really poor, just they were so young on the defensive line. I think they started 2 or 3 guys that were freshmen. So, I mean, it's really hard to come in there and impact a game, especially a big game where, you know, Clemson's got all these 5 stars and stuff and that some of the ACC schools don't necessarily have. So some of these defensive ends, the younger talent, come in and impact the game against those schools that don't get those recruits. However, when you're playing at Ohio State, who also gets 4 and 5-star linemen on the offensive side, it's not as easy. You have to have more experience. You have to have experience in these big games against good players as well. And I think that's something that we didn't focus on enough, and that a lot of people didn't really focus on enough, was the war in the trenches. And Clemson wasn't as strong in the trenches. And I think that's what made the biggest difference. And that's what made the biggest difference in the last 2 Ohio State games is the trenches. Their linemen don't necessarily pass block that well, but run blocking, it seems like they're exceeding, and just keep feeding Trey Sermon, and he's having a great performance, as you mentioned. I also think Ohio State wreaked a bunch of havoc on Trevor Lawrence. He was under pressure all game. Yes, he threw for 400 yards, but he was under pressure. He was getting knocked down multiple times. Even if he got the pass away, he was still most of the time on the turf. So I think they did a really good job up front, and it'll be interesting to see, that transitioning into the title game. I think it'll be interesting to see if Ohio State can keep that same level of play in the trenches. I think one down thing for Bama is I've hit on it a couple. I don't think their defense is up to speed as normally it is. And I think that starts up front in the front 7. They don't necessarily have the front 7 that they've had in years past. I know they've got Surtain on the outside, and he's a great corner. And I think if Ohio State's going to keep in this game and possibly pull out a win, it's going to have to start with the running game. It's going to have to start with Trey Sermon, because Alabama still has the playmakers at cornerback and the safety position. Their linebackers have kind of regressed. I know their one linebacker Dylan Moses came back from injury last year. For this year, he's kind of regressed, fallen down some draft boards, hasn't really impressed people as much this year. And their front 7 as a whole hasn't really impressed. So I think if their offensive line can play as well as they have the last 2 games, they can establish the run and the play action. They've got a chance to keep up with Bama and possibly win this thing.
Yeah, you mentioned the Clemson defensive line being really young. One kid on there, Brian Breesy, the number 1 recruit from last year. He was who I thought of when you said really good, but just inexperienced, being a freshman. But hope to see that guy in a Vikings uniform in a few years, because that kid's a stud. But yeah, no, I agree with you about Alabama. I think we've kind of seen their defense. Their defense, I think, has played better in the last few games. Obviously, the Florida game's kind of a crazy game, but I think their defense improved a little bit. But it's not the Alabama defense we're used to seeing. Yeah, I mean, they're another team where that defensive line just doesn't have the 3 future NFL starting defensive linemen we're used to it seeing, and same kind of with their linebackers. Will Anderson's another guy that had a really good game against Notre Dame. He's a freshman for them, another future Viking, I'm sure. I mean, I do agree. I think it's going to be. I think Ohio State's going to have a lot of success against that defense. Just assuming Justin Fields is healthy. You mentioned it that their defense just isn't great, and Trey Sermon, kind of like what I said earlier, he's having a great postseason basically. So I think they'll be able to establish that run, get their run game going, and then their secondary is still really good, but Ohio State's receivers are still really good. So I mean, it's good receiver against good cornerback and safety. So I think that's going to be an interesting matchup of seeing these this 5-star receiver and Chris Olave against Patrick Surtain and like those kind of matchups. But I'm excited to see it because I think I mean the over under was set like at like an all time high for this game, and I don't know if it's gonna be like 40-40, but like I think when you really look at it, both these teams' defense is their weakness and their offense is their strength, and could put up points. So, I think it's going to be. I think it's going to be kind of like you mentioned. If Ohio State can establish that run game, be dominant up front, they can really control the game from the start. But I think it'll be a good game. I'm excited for it. I think after seeing Ohio State against Clemson, I think you can say Ohio State right now is the second best team in the country with how well they played last game. So you have the two best teams in the country.
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, there might be some disagreements there, but I think that's true. And I also think a really big thing too is like Notre Dame. They didn't play terribly offensively against Bama. I know the stats probably don't back it up and stuff like that, but they had a decent game plan and a decent recipe to stay with Alabama. The thing is, they don't have as skilled of a quarterback or skilled players as the likes of Ohio State. And that's where I think Ohio State can be a little more successful if they have the same kind of game plan and same recipe because they've got better skill players. You mentioned Chris Olave. We all know Justin Fields. We've also got Garrett Wilson, another 5-star guy, and another wide receiver that can do some damage on the outside. And you're gonna have, if you're Bama, you're gonna have to choose which one of the receivers you're gonna want Surtain on. And for as good as cornerbacks are, or your best corners in college, you line them up with the best receivers in the country, they're probably going to get beat 5 or 6 times. It's just there's no way you can
Right.
stop
Yeah.
the best receivers in the country the whole entire game, especially at the college level when you're still working on some things like your footwork and your reads, all that. So, it'll be interesting. I think that's where the game within the game lies is, which set of skill players has a better game. And I think that will kind of determine it because if you have Trey Sermon putting up close to 200 rushing yards, Chris Olave having a nice game, Garrett Wilson having a nice game, and on the flip side, you have Najee Harris having a decent game but not as good as Sermon, and then Devontae Smith having a good game, and maybe you get Waddle back, or maybe Mechie has a pretty good game, but not as good as Ohio State, then Ohio State can succeed. And I think, again, the key will be establishing that run and kind of controlling the clock and keeping Bama off the field.
Yeah, I mean because people talk about Alabama with Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle might even be back and Mechie and all these guys, but like Ohio State wants to run the football, Alabama wants to run the football too, and you talked about it earlier with Lane Kiffin's play calling on his last game. Like Steve Sarkisian has like when they break down the route combinations and when they break down how they beat a coverage, it's a lot of creative and innovative high level stuff. And then at the end of the day, they still want to run the football. So I think it'll be interesting to, like you kind of talking about earlier, to see how he calls the game and how much they throw the ball versus how much they say, do we want to run the ball, establish the line, control the game. And that's, I think, what Ohio State's going to do as well. So, yeah, I think it'll be the who controls the line of scrimmage is going to be important because both teams' defensive lines aren't as good as the other team's offensive lines when it comes to controlling that line of scrimmage.
Yeah, I'd agree with you there. And if I had to hedge one way or the other, I think I'd obviously hedge towards the Alabama side. But in terms of from a gambling perspective, like you mentioned, I'd probably lean towards the over. I mean, I know it's historically high for the national championship game, But again, I just don't think these defenses are as strong as they've been for these teams in years past. And I think they've got enough
Yeah.
skill on the offensive side to put up points.
Well, and in a game like this, it's more fun to cheer for fourth quarter. It's high scoring, yes, but it's which team can get that last stop. Like that's fun, but you also want to cheer for, man, they just scored. Now Ohio State's going to go answer, and Ohio State answers. Now Alabama's like, those are the fun games. So that's where you don't want to take the under, because then you're basically cheering for a turnover or a punt or something like that. And because yeah, I mean, I like it. And both these teams have the ability to say, well, you know what, the other team's selling out against a run. They got 7 guys up there in the box. We're not going to be able to run against them, and they can both take those deep shots down the field, score quick, put up points, and I mean, like those are both great options for both of these teams. So yeah, I think from a gambling perspective, you almost have to take the over, because both these teams can score that quick and put up that many points on each other. I think the over would probably be the play. I think for a side, I think if it stays above 7, you have to lean Ohio State, just because you have to expect a close game. But I think Alabama is the right side if it's 7 or below. I think Alabama does win, but I think when you get above that 7, you kind of want to start taking the underdog, because especially in a game like this where it will be, you expect it to be close, and just I mean it's easy for a team to lose by 3. It's a lot different to have a team lose by 8 or 9, and that's so it's just something where it's like you kind of have to look at that number and see where that number's at.
Yeah, and I think this could be a game pretty similar to what we saw the first time Clemson beat Bama in the national championship game, where it's back and forth, and whoever gets 1 or 2 stops, and then whoever comes down the field with the ball last wins the game. And that's something
Mm-hmm.
too to keep in mind. Like you said, if that number is above 7, it's probably smarter to play Ohio State, because if it's coming down to the last possession of the game, it's obviously going to be 7 points or less. Whereas if it's under 7, the smarter side might be the Bama side of the game. I do think it'll be a good game. Ohio State seems to finally have found their mojo on offense and figured things out, at least enough on defense to keep things competitive. And yeah, I think it'll, whichever defense can get the most stops, which I don't think there will be many, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, Before the national championship game, though, we have 2 Bradley games finally. And
yeah.
I know we're both chomping at the bit to see Bradley get back on the court. Um, they play UNI, and I want to get your thoughts on UNI. I know what some of my other Bradley friends are saying about UNI. I kind of want to get your take. I'm still in the belief of Ben Jacobson's a good coach. He's probably one of the best Valley coaches in the last 20, 30 years. I had faith in him to turn this thing around. They just lost 2 in Evansville, who I think is better than people are giving him credit for. But, man, they are a different team without A.J. Green.
Yeah, I mean, completely different team indeed. He was kind of their guy they could rely on whenever they needed a shot late in the shot clock, late in the game, something like that. They needed a basket if they were in a slump. They'd go to him. He'd come through. And now it's kind of, okay, do we want to go to Trey Burhow? Do we want to go to Austin Fife? Who are we going to? They don't have the set player that they're necessarily going to, which sometimes in a way it's good, sometimes it's bad. Right now when they need shots and they need baskets, it's a bad thing because they can't really lean on anybody. But if they, all things are flowing and they're playing as a team and playing as well as Ben Jacobson teams can, then it's okay. Who are we going to single in and stop? It doesn't matter. They're going to score anyways. I'm still in the belief that this is a good team. I'm with you on that. I'm also with you on Evansville might be better. I mean, Evansville's sitting at 3-1. It's early, so we don't know. We're still figuring things out right now in the Valley, and Bradley does not. In years past, too, this is 2 road games back to back, and since Wardle's taken over, as well as I do, Bradley has not had the best success in Valley road games. And this is our first road test in the Valley. So I wouldn't necessarily write off UNI already right now, not just for Bradley this weekend, but, also down the line in the Valley, in the tournament and stuff like that. This is still going to be a tough team. I mean, they feel like they've been doubted ever since the preseason tournament this year, where they lost 2 of 3, only came away with 1 win. A lot of people had high praise on them then, and then after that tournament, it's kind of turned, okay, maybe Northern Iowa's not as good, and I just have a feeling that they will turn it around.
Yeah, what really kind of surprises me what is you were mentioning with AJ Green. It's like who's your guy, who's getting the last shot, where the offense is running through. Now they don't have that, but what surprised me is the first few games they played after he was out, they were hanging around with some teams that were better than them, even probably with AJ Green. Like they hung around with, I think he was out for the Richmond game.
Yep.
And they hung around at Richmond, who at the time was ranked. They now, like, you look at them and they just lost 2 at Evansville, and they were pretty much down both those entire games. Like they did not play well. So it's kind of like reverse, where you think, okay, they're gonna teams aren't gonna know how to play them because they just you lost the whole person you key on as an opponent. They're gonna have they're gonna be playing with some emotion, some fire with AJ Green going down, but it's like been the opposite. And
Well, and
so I don't know. I think it's interesting because I do think they are a good team, but you also watch them and you're like, they're just like, they've never been a great defensive team, but you watch them and you say they can't guard anybody. Offensively, they're having to go through these post players who aren't as good when they have to be relied on, and not just set pick and rolls for AJ Green, or not just get offensive rebounds and stuff like that. And now they have to rely on their other guards like Burhow, who like are good players, but you don't realize how much these guys play off AJ Green. Like they play off AJ Green so much because of all the help he draws from the weak side defenders. And now you're seeing these guys have to step up and be that guy, and it's just not quite there. And I think Ben Jacobson will get it figured out. But every year, like as far as I can remember, since I've started following Bradley hoops, or even a few years before that, when you and I would play Iowa State, you and I always had a guy. Like I think back to, they had Wes Washburn, who got the last shot in that game against Evansville in the championship. They had a guy like Paul Jesperson or someone like that maybe wasn't like a create your own shot guy, but he was a guy coming off that screen. The ball was going, he was getting that shot. Everyone knew it. You think back to the last few years before AJ Green got there, like that's who they've had, and now they've had AJ Green. He's been the guy, and this is kind of the first time I can think of you and I not having a go-to scorer, a go-to guy where it's everyone knows he's taking the last shot. And I think you and I still adjusting to that. But yeah, I mean, to your point about playing on the road, like Bradley's played better on the road in the last 2 years, I would say, 2-3 years. But I don't think we've won it in Cedar Falls under Wardle. We really have only beaten the bad teams on the road. We haven't beaten Drake on the road in a few years. We haven't beaten Loyola on the road. We haven't beaten UNI on the road. But at the same time, this is a different team even than last year's team. Like, this is a team that can beat anybody on any given night, and they've shown that and they've proven that. So I think I would not be surprised. You said don't be surprised to see UNI hang around, not only against Bradley but later in the year. I would not be surprised to see UNI win the first game against Bradley purely from a rust standpoint. But also, I don't think you should be surprised to see Bradley win the next night by 15 points. Like, they'll make those adjustments, they'll get things figured out, they'll shake the rust off, and then they will show that they are the better team.
Yeah, and that's kind of where, you know, we keep saying Bradley's a different team this year. This is a team that can compete with anybody, can win on any given night. And this is kind of one of those situations where, for me as a fan and someone who watches a sport, I want to see that. I want to see that, you know, hey, this is a different team. This is a team that can win any night. This is a team that can go into, you know, UNI and, you know, rattle off 2 wins. Maybe the first night it's not pretty, it's ugly, whatever. And then the second night they make the adjustments that they need to, and they absolutely dominate them. That's where you want to. Right now, I think Bradley's in this spot where it's okay. We know we're good. How good are we, though? Like, just how good are we? And I think that's where I want to see. Okay, this really is a different team. Like, the last 2 years, we've been good, but we haven't been great. Now I want to see if we're not only good, we're great.
But see, here's my thing is I understand what you're saying, and I 100% agree. These are games that great teams win. If it was a normal year and Bradley was playing in Cedar Falls on January 21st or whatever this weekend, January whatever, and there's no AJ Green, I would be more and they lost, I would be more upset at that. It's not a normal year. They play back-to-back road games. They have not played in 3 weeks. I think that if they do lose that first game, there has to be a little.
Wait, here's the thing. I'm not saying that they have to win both. I just want to see them compete in both. Whether that means, I know I said, you know, win both, but I just want to see them compete and compete hard in both.
And I think they will, because that's one, like, Wardle has always been about defense and rebounding, and that he's always preached defense and rebounding travels. And you'll hear analysts say that all the time, and I think they will. And we just talked about UNI's not a good offensive team. I think this has a chance to be a really low scoring game too. Could be a real ugly game. But I'm just saying, like, in a normal year, Bradley doesn't play well up there, I'm more concerned. Bradley doesn't play well the first game, I'm not as concerned as maybe some fans will get, but I'm not as concerned as what I would be in a normal year. It's a crazy year. I think we're going to see this we're going to see this probably, I mean, we've already seen it in the Valley, but I think we're going to see this with Bradley too, in these back-to-back games of Bradley's going to look good one night and then not look good the other night. You've seen it in the NBA when they're playing back-to-backs on 2 different nights. You're seeing it in college basketball all around. Like I know this from gambling, but the last 2 weeks there have been 2 teams that lost the first night by 30-plus points and then won outright the second night. Like, there's just so much inconsistency in player performance night in and night out. I think that we're going to see that with Bradley and with the Valley. So it's really anyone can win on any given night because you're playing these back-to-back games. And I think you're going to also really see who are the good teams and the well-coached teams. The well-coached teams are going to make adjustments, and if they lose the first night, are going to win the second night. And that's where I still don't count out Ben Jacobson and UNI, but that's where I think you're really going to see the separation between Bradley, Loyola, Drake. Like, Drake beat SIU game 1 and then beat them by more the second night. That shows you the difference between Drake and SIU right there. And I think that's what we're going to see between the good teams and the bad teams.
We'll talk about Drake in a little bit because I've got some thoughts on Drake. But back to this Bradley and UNI.
12-0.
Yeah. But back to Bradley and you and I do agree. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised to see Bradley come out a little flat in that first game. I think this layoff kind of helped in a way because I think we're going to get Terry Nolan back for the first
Yep.
game, which he wouldn't have been available for Valpo or Loyola probably. So I think it kind of helped in a way. You might see some rust, like you mentioned. Might shoot pretty poorly the first night. Don't get too worried though. I think the adjustments in the second game are really when I want to see this team be a great team. I think it comes to that second game and see the adjustments made. And it's not just this game, it's going to be the whole Valley year because they're playing back to backs most of the time. I want to see the adjustments made in that second game and Bradley come out and play better in that second game. I want to see that. And if I see that, then, I'll have more faith in this team, not only in the Valley tournament, but, going into March Madness. And you and I think,
And that's
good.
I was just saying that's something I think, and this is just from personal experience being around Bradley, being around the coaching staff. I'm sure it's similar with other programs, but that is something I took away from Bradley's coaching staff with Wardle that I was like super impressed with. Like when Bradley has played those games back to back to back, think about the Valley tournaments, think about the preseason tournaments they've played in. They have played really, really well every single night. And I think back to when we traveled to the Bahamas, Cancun, went down to St. Louis. Those were games where it was play one day, that night you're watching film, scouting your opponent for the next night, playing the next day. Bradley, like Wardle and his staff, like I shout out to Jimmy Foster, Mike Bargan, and Drew Adams, the three assistants. They do a hell of a job scouting, coming up with the game plan, and then Wardle and the entire staff putting it together. And that's where I think that good coaching on that second game, making those adjustments, where Bradley is really, really going to be strong in, because I've seen them do it. And so I think that is something that's really going to help Bradley is I think that's something that coaching staff excels in. And that's like one of those underrated hidden things is playing a back-to-back game and how well you make those adjustments. It's different when it's a different opponent. It's completely different. You wipe the board clean, all that stuff. So I'm interested to see how they do it with the same opponent.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. I've noticed too, just watching as a fan, that Wardle likes to show different wrinkles when they have back-to-back games. I've seen it in multiple Valley tournaments now, and I've seen it in preseason tournaments. They'll come out and show a different look in the second game versus what they did in the first game. So he'll not only, it's not only
Oh yeah.
it's not only just the adjustments, the technical things. He'll actually throw out new sets and kind of confuse them and show them something that may not have shown up on the tape. And that's what I agree with you there. I mean, they do
Yeah.
a very good job in those.
Well, and Wardle's also somebody that if it's working, like when they go to that zone and it's working, they stay in it. And that also beneficial because it's when they find a certain set that's working and they can just run a couple counters off it, but it stays in the same formation, it stays in the same idea. It's like when a football team runs the same formation, but they can run a pass, a run, all of that off of it, but it all looks the same. Like that's what he does. And that's beneficial because now you're basically telling the opponent, we can run this and it works, and we're going to make you scout it and make you prepare for it. And then we're not going to run it the next day because we know you didn't prepare for our three other sets. And or like when they go to the zone and the zone works, it's coming and you have to prepare for it. But Wardle's going to show it to you, make you play against it, and then they'll go back to man and be like, well, you spent your whole practice session worrying about our zone. We showed it to you. Now we're going to go man. And it just that's where I think the chess piece and the mind game of coaching that I think Wardle has an edge in. And that's why you bring in a former JUCO head coach in Mike Bargan. That's why you bring in a former AAU coach or whatever Coach Adams was. Like, that's why you bring in those guys who have that same mindset as you, just at different levels.
Yeah, and it pays off for them. We've seen the success, especially. Uh, and back to you and I. You made the points about they don't have a guy right now, and that's what I was talking about when I was saying, right now, their offense isn't really moving in the Valley right now, and they're looking for somebody to score a bucket. In those situations, they'd normally turn to AJ Green. Now they need somebody else to step up. And if they can't get just one person to step up, they may need to change how they orient their offense and what they do, what different sets they show. And that's something I think we should watch out for this weekend is Ben Jacobson might also be realizing that, hey, my normal offense isn't working. I might have to run some new sets and get something going just to see the ball go in the basket a couple times.
Yeah, and that I mean, like Ben Jacobson, I don't think, and this isn't like a knock on him, but he's not above scrapping everything and starting over. Like some coaches are so headstrong on whatever, like what my system is going to work no matter what. And I think Ben Jacobson's the type of guy that realizes we had a system. There was a variable that changed in that system. Now we have to change the system. And I think that's another reason why I think if the first game does not go in favor of Bradley, you have to also look at that and say, just like how Wardle makes other teams scout against certain things, Bradley scout against what they've seen on tape because that's what you know, and then it may not, like they may never see those looks in those sets. Now, like, does that mean that UNI is better? No, it just means that it's going to take Bradley longer to adjust and get things figured out. But Bradley still has the better athletes. Bradley still has, I think, probably has at least four better players on the court at all times than UNI does, maybe even five. And that's where you just have to hope that your athleticism and your skill beats them over their scheme. You think about they get an easy backdoor layup. Well, you have Ari Boya there to block it, and maybe he didn't see that coming, and they didn't scout against it. That's where you want your 7-footer to go get a block because he's a 7-footer who can block shots. So, yeah, I completely agree with you though. I think that's something that we could see. And UNI's going home too. Like I don't think they've played a home game in a little bit, so that also could factor in. And but yeah, I think those are things to watch for in a game like this, where if UNI wants, we talked about Bradley, like Bradley wants to be a great team. These are 2 games you win. UNI wants to stay in the race for not playing on Thursday. You have to win one of these games. You have to win at home, but you have to beat a team that you could be competing with for seeding later in the year.
Yeah, and this could help, begin a turnaround on their season. They could start to turn a corner. Whereas, let's say they lose both these games to Bradley, and then it's full-on panic mode. You're sitting at 1-5 in the conference. You won one game out of conference. You've got 2 wins on the year, and it's full-on panic mode. Okay, we got to avoid Thursday. Now, if you win one game, yeah, you only have 2 wins in conference, and you're still sitting towards the bottom. But at the same time, Bradley's just played 2 games. Valpo will only have played 2 games. You can still get back into things. You still have games that are favorable for you and stuff like that. So I think it's an important weekend for both teams. And, I wouldn't be surprised at all if we split this series.
I mean, they have to win at least one game, I think, against Bradley to get their, like you mentioned, get their season back on track, because they play 2 at Loyola, then they play Drake at home, then they go to Carbondale. And Loyola is another team that likes to beat you with scheme, not necessarily with athleticism or skill. But that's it. They're a tough team at home to beat. Then you have to play Drake, who's probably the hottest team in the Valley, if not the hottest team in the country, maybe other than Gonzaga. And then you have to go to Carbondale, which it's a long bus ride. No one wants to be in Carbondale. And SIU playing at home, like they're still a tough team, even though they haven't played up to what I think people thought they could be this year. But But yeah, I mean, that's a gauntlet of a stretch to have coming up, and I agree with you. I think if they don't win one game this year, I think that mentality and that mindset of, well, we can still salvage a 6 seed or a 5 seed this year is almost out the window, because they could very well be staring 2, 4, 6. They could very well be staring 5 losses in a row, 5 losses out of their next 7 games coming up.
Yeah, and like I said, if you drop both of these, it's almost panic time. It's okay. We gotta fix everything. We gotta, scrap the whole playbook. Let's start over. We gotta find something that goes because if you sit there at 1-5, you've got 12 games left, and if you want to avoid Thursday, you probably got to win at least half those games.
Yeah, I mean, Illinois State's going to be down there. You have to think Valpo's probably going to be down there, and then after that, like with the way Evansville's been playing, like that's a team you didn't expect to be
3-1 right
playing
now.
on Friday. So that's a team you now have to beat out that you just lost 2 games to. Indiana State's kind of been up and down, and UNI, for example, gets them at home. So maybe if you win those 2 games, those come in handy later in the year. But Indiana State's still a team that I would think is better than Northern Iowa. Like right now, you're competing with, I think you're competing right now with Southern Illinois, Indiana State, and Evansville for the last 2 spots on Thursday. You've
Maybe
already
even
lost two to
State.
yeah. Yeah, could be Missouri State. They're just such a wild card team that you just don't know. But you've already lost 2 to Evansville. You go to SIU, so you think you're probably going to lose both of those games. I don't know. I think it's I think it's I think if they lose both these games to Bradley, it's going to be hard to not be seeing Northern Iowa on Thursday, because I don't think they're going to win 2 at Loyola. I mean, and you look at this gauntlet. Best case scenario, they win 1 against Bradley, 1 against Loyola, 1 against Southern, and they beat Drake. That's still a 4-3 record in those 7 games. That's still that's good, but you're not going 4-3 in a 7-game stretch is not going to get you a top 5 seed. Now you're battling for the 6th seed, probably with a team like Evansville who you lost 2 games to already, or a team like Missouri State, who like we saw last year could go on a little bit of run, finish the year strong. So yeah, I think this is kind of a do or die weekend for Northern Iowa.
Yeah, I mean it's just Bradley's coming out party in the Valley. Heard some comments from Wardle this week circulating saying that he's ready. The team's ready. They feel like they're being slept on now because they haven't been here for a couple weeks. You always like to see that little extra fire before a game, especially a game like this. Like you mentioned, I don't think we've won here maybe since he's been the coach, but I know in the last few years we definitely haven't won here. So it'd be nice to win a couple, maybe, hopefully win one, maybe win both. As far as the outlook of the Valley right now, we'll take a look at the full standings. Right now, you've got Drake sitting at 4-0, 13-0 overall, and then Loyola right behind them, 2-0, 7-2 overall. Mo State behind them, along with Evansville, both at 3-1 in conference. Bradley and Valpo have not played yet. Then you've got SIU Carbondale at 1-3, surprisingly. Like you mentioned, UNI 1-3, Illinois State 0-2, Indiana State also maybe a little surprising at 0-4.
Yeah, I think Indiana State's probably the biggest surprise there. We talked about them when we were kind of previewing the Valley. We both kind of liked what Indiana State had. They had some good young players that kind of showed a lot of flashes last year. I think between them and SIU are 2 kind of the teams that I'm the biggest surprise at, just like surprise, because both of them kind of showed what they could have last year, and they just haven't lived up to that. And then I think obviously Drake is the biggest surprise the other way. Undefeated against the spread. They've looked really good in a lot of games they've played. They've beaten a Power 5 team. Yes, it's Kansas State, but it's a Power 5 team. Like, they've looked incredible this year, and you wonder when they're going to come back down to earth a little bit, kind of that regress to the median. Um, but I
I,
think at the same time, I think it's like the style they're playing, like you can't think that they're going to score 80 points a game like it seems like they do, but they keep doing it and they keep winning. And, it's like they just said they've been impressive.
yeah, to an extent, I think they've been impressive. We mentioned Indiana State and SIU, two teams that we thought would do better, maybe not getting the most out of their guys this year. So it's really hard to say, too. And the biggest gripe I have with Drake right now is their best win is still Kansas State. And Kansas State's ranked 153 in KenPom. So Drake hasn't beaten anybody noteworthy yet. And that's my biggest gripe is like, yeah, these wins are impressive. They're undefeated against the spread and stuff like that. But they haven't really played, not even quad one teams. They haven't even played quad two teams yet. So it's not, it's impressive to an extent. And I think what we'll really see is Drake this weekend when they play Loyola. Yes, it's at home, but when they play Loyola, we'll see everything Drake's made of. Because game one, if they go out there and win that, okay, they're for real. They're right up there in the top of the valley. Game two, if they don't make the same adjustments and Loyola goes out and kills them game two, then it's okay. They're right there, but maybe on a back-to-back, they're not on the same level in the tournament. They could maybe have some problems playing back-to-backs, things like that. So I think this weekend's going to be very big for them. Loyola's already challenged themselves with a couple games, and it's kind of the struggle that we see with mid-majors. We both follow Bradley, so we know this as well. When you're not necessarily the best in your conference, it's harder to schedule, better teams, better mid-major teams even, because it's not necessarily a good win for that mid-major team even. Whereas if you've been at the top of the conference or won a conference tournaments like Bradley has, it's a little easier to schedule some high-quality mid-majors, especially on short notice in a pandemic year. So I won't fully discredit Drake, but at the same time, I think we do have to step back and look at who they've played. Their best win, again, still coming against Kansas State. I do think they're a good team. They've exceeded expectations, obviously. I just don't know if I'm ready to say they're on the same level as Loyola, as Bradley. I think right now, in my mind, I know Bradley hasn't played in a while. I still think right now with the injury to AJ Green, it's Bradley and Loyola and everybody else.
Yeah, I think what I meant by saying that they've been the most impressive team is simply the fact that remember that game against Bradley last year in the tournament where Liam Robbins ate Bradley's lunch money every game they played last year. I think seeing how they've played and how they've adjusted, like they would play a lot of five guards, like they would play like I think of like they played like the Warriors would play when they moved Draymond Green to the five and go completely small. Like that's how Drake would play. They would play small. Their center would be 6'7", 6'8". Like their lineup was even smaller and more guard oriented than when Bradley would have Eli at the five last year and Sean Henry at the four. Like that was our small lineup, but Sean and Eli aren't guards, and they would play four guards and one guard / forward. And I like now this year they've completely been able to go to that lineup extensively. Like they don't have a big man that requires a post touch, and I think that's what's impressed me is they've changed what they do. They've gone fully to that roster. They've gone fully to the run and gun, shoot the three, high scoring games. We're not going to play with a post guy. We're going to live with a team who beating us with a post player because it's the Warriors mentality of your 2-point post touch is less than our 3-point fast break. And I agree with you. I don't know if I'm ready to put them in the conversation with Bradley and Loyola yet until they show me what they can do at Loyola this weekend. But I think when you look at them compared to how Bradley's played in their non-conference games, I think Drake has looked impressive with how they have won and how they've played. When I look at Bradley and I say, well, like, yeah, Bradley hung with Xavier, who's ranked now, but they also lost to, a good, but they lost at home to South Dakota State. They hung with Missouri, yes, on the road and should have won that game. But they've also struggled with some lesser opponents this year, it seems like. Miami of Ohio, for example. And so, like, Drake just hasn't had those games. They haven't struggled with anyone. They've beaten everyone they're supposed to beat by what Vegas says they're going to win by, and hence why they're undefeated against the spread. So I don't know if I'm ready to put them in that category, but they've looked good enough that if they honestly, if they go 1-1 this weekend, I would put them up there with Loyola and Bradley as the top tier of the Valley.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too. I think it's interesting what they're doing. The Valley for the last several years has been more of a slow-paced league, not as much run and gun, and they're kind of going against the curve with that, more up-tempo and trying to score. And again, I don't know if many of these Valley teams have the capability to keep with them. And I think that's what you've seen in their first two sets of Valley games. Indiana State doesn't have the scoring to keep with them. SIU, we know SIU is very good defensively and they're defense oriented. But when you get up and down like Drake does, they don't have the scores. They don't have the athletes to necessarily keep up with them and score in those high 70s or 80s. So I think that's, teams like that they can take advantage of. But somebody like Loyola, I don't know if they can necessarily take advantage to that extent. I think Loyola, when they want to, they can still score a lot of points. Yes, they naturally want to play slower paced. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the tempo of those games go. Because if it's high scoring and Drake's, even if Drake's just keeping in the game and it's high scoring and Loyola barely wins, but it's a high scoring game, then that might even on its own still tell me Drake's a good team and up there with the top of the, cream of the crop in the Valley because they're able to do that against a very good team, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, they're averaging 84 points a game. I don't think they're going to get to that against Loyola. But you mentioned it, the Valley. When you think of the Valley, it's a defensive, lower scoring conference. And the fact that they are undefeated over the whole year, but undefeated in conference play, looked really good in conference play so far, and scoring 84 points a game, like they're going against the grain again in the Valley of what we kind of know the Valley to be as. Like it wasn't that long ago, like Bradley won a game in Carbondale 55-54. And like that's the Valley basketball. 55-54 was the final score. And they're out here winning games 83 to 61, So yeah, they have two games against Loyola this weekend. I think if they go 1-1, I think that kind of validates them a little bit more, at least for people who follow the Valley and know kind of how the Valley runs. But I think the other team I want to talk about, since we're talking about.
If we catch crab in Virginia and Maryland, do we file taxes?
Why does it keep playing? The other team I don't know why it keeps playing. I keep stopping it. The other team I want to talk about from the Valley. By the way, did you have the Grizzlies tonight too?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, they're gonna lose outright to the Cavaliers, who
I saw that.
have 7 guys playing. 8 guys playing.
I just saw that too.
The other team I want to talk about was Indiana State, and we kind of have talked about them a little bit already this year, or already on this today. But I mentioned them earlier. I think that they are the biggest disappointment to me this year. And I don't know if you have a biggest team, a team that's disappointed you the most this year, but like
Uh,
they've struggled. They've really, I don't know if it's they missed Jordan Barnes that much, but like they have struggled this year. And I, after watching them play last year, you kind of had the mindset of, man, this is a team that's got some good young players. They got a year under their belt. They're going to be better next year. And they haven't. Like, they lost by 12 to Purdue, and then they lost by
19 to
by
SLU.
19 to SLU, and you're like, okay, yeah, two good teams. It is what it is. But then they get pretty much walloped by Drake in the first game. Then they keep it close against them in the second game, but lose that one. Lose by 10 to Missouri State, and they keep it close, but lose the second game to Missouri State. And you're like, they haven't played a ton of games compared to other Valley teams, but like they haven't been able to put it together. I don't think they've only beaten bad teams for their 3 wins. So I don't know. I guess I was just expecting more from them. And Southern Illinois kind of in the same category, but not as much as Indiana State was for me.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I don't know if it's shocking though. I mean, we know how tough the Valley is night in, night out. But at the same time, it's while it is disappointing, they've got a chance to right the ship kind of here with their next 5 games. I mean, they've got SIU this weekend, who, like you just mentioned, has struggled in Valley play to start. And then they go to Illinois State, which we both probably agree is probably the worst team in the Valley right now. And then they've got Evansville at home. So, I mean, they've got 5 games where you can really get back on track. Maybe not, win all of them, but, if you go 3-2, you're looking at least better than what you're at 0-4. And then, build that into some more momentum getting to the tournament, because we've seen teams that play on Thursday be able to make a run. I mean, we just saw it last year. So, while seeding is important, if they get hot at the right time and get it figured out at the right time, they can still make a run at the tournament. So they have been a little disappointing, but I think when you look at the Valley, like we know, it's tough to beat a team any given night. And, with these back-to-backs, they seem like they're playing better on the second night so far, but just not, closing the deal, not being able to get over the hump. And I think once they get over the hump, they'll be able to figure things out more, and they'll be all right. I do think they're a little disappointing, and I don't know how much, it'll fluctuate to end the year to where their seating is great, but I think they'll get things figured out, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what we were talking about with you and I. Who, like, going into this down the stretch, who are you going to be competing with for that 5th or 6th spot? And I think Indiana State's another team that could find themselves competing with Northern Iowa or competing with Southern Illinois for that to not play on Thursday. And I mean, if they get hot down the stretch, yeah, they could, but at the same time, like, is it too late? Is losing your first 5 conference games too late to pick it up down the stretch?
Yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying there. Again, it's still a pretty young team. They're very young. So that's why, especially with them or SIU, those teams are so young that if they get hot down the stretch, then, they could make some noise in the tournament, like we saw with Valpo, like we've seen with Drake and other teams that have done it in years past, where they cause some havoc, get some upsets. That's what I think plays into both those teams' advantages. And that's where I think seeding is more important for a team like Northern Iowa. You've got a more experienced team. They've got a little more years under their belt than, these other two teams. And they definitely don't want to play, try and go 4 games in 4 days. They definitely want to try and go 3 games in 3 days because it'll be easier for them. I mean, and that's also a thing too. I mean, they were picked to be the best team in the Valley, and now you're sitting here, you're down your best player, and now you're 1-3. And if you get a Thursday game, you're just going to be like, well, we're going to get AJ Green back next year, so might as well pack it in and try again next year.
Yeah, I think the biggest storyline for Indiana State, though, will actually be if they have to play on Thursday. I think it's Greg Lansing's last year. I mean, there was talk about him potentially not seeing this year with them, and he made it. But we know he hasn't had success in St. Louis. Like every year they go down there, I think it was 2 years ago they got the 3rd seed, lost game 1. Last year, 2 years ago they were the 3rd. And then the year before that, I think they were, I believe the 5 seed they were playing on Friday. I remember that, and anyway, they lose the first game down there, and almost every year. And for a team like that I think that hasn't had that success in St. Louis, playing on Thursday is almost like the kiss of death. You're not going to go very far if you're them. And but yeah, I don't know. They've disappointed me this year. I think they were a team I was expecting a little more out of. I think people were as a whole maybe expecting a little bit more out of them, but I think the Valley, I think when you look at the Valley as a whole, I think the Valley has 3 potentially really good teams, and Drake, Loyola, and Bradley. 3 teams that I think could win a game in the NCAA tournament if either of those 3 teams were to get there. And then I think they have a few wild cards. I think you look at Missouri State as this team that I don't think is well coached, but has athletes, has players. You never know what you're going to get out of them. Seems like some nights they're going to be really hungry defensively and play really aggressively on the offensive end and score 80 points, and then other nights they score 53 because they just don't care. They're almost like an NBA team in that regard. And then I think there's a couple other teams that we just don't know are a wild card just because we haven't seen them play enough. We don't really know what we're going to get. We don't know what they are yet. I think that's kind of where Indiana State is right now, just because they've probably played the least amount of games in the Valley, maybe other than Valpo. But then I think I'm going to throw Evansville in that wild card mix simply because I think Evansville could be playing on Friday. And I think that there's a chance that Evansville finishes 5th or 6th, especially with a team like UNI regressing, especially with a team like Southern Illinois possibly regressing. Those are now 2 spots in the top 6 that could be open for them to jump into. So I think there's a couple wild cards in that regard, but I think the Valley as a whole is just as strong, even with UNI down, it's just as strong as it has been. And the 2 nights and 2 games, Bradley is very fortunate with the way their scheduling has worked out to where they play at UNI without AJ Green. They get Loyola at home. Those are the 2 biggest matchups you have, and you get kind of breaks with those. You get one team at home, and you get one team without their best player, even though it's on the road. And that's an underrated thing in the season. If Bradley were to rattle off, I don't know, 14, 15 conference wins, or maybe not quite that many, but they were to rattle off those wins like that, that's where you look back at the schedule and you're you point to those games. And
then you add in the fact that their last 2 games are Drake at home. Mm-hmm. So I mean, like you mentioned, the scheduling's big there.
Yeah, I mean, your toughest – obviously we'll have to still figure out what Indiana State is. They have some time. They have some games where they play Indiana State, but you go to Indiana State and you go to Missouri State. Those are your two toughest road games, in my opinion. Missouri State only because it's the farthest trip, and they're a true wild card team. But now instead of going to Valpo twice back to back, you go 2 separate trips. That's almost better because now you get a chance to play them, play a few more games, adjust your game plan, then play them again. You get Drake and Illinois and Loyola at home, which is huge. And honestly, I think the biggest thing out of all this, you get Evansville at home, because I'm only saying that because right now Bradley plays at UNI and then at home against Evansville. If that were to be the other way around, and you go to Evansville for 2 games, who's a confident team right now, like I think Bradley's the better team, obviously, but that's a scary place to be in because you're playing a confident team at home back-to-back nights. I still would think Bradley could win both those games, but that you just would rather play a confident team like that at home, where you take the life out of them easier.
Yeah, and you look at Evansville's schedule too. On the reverse of that, they've got Illinois State this weekend. So imagine if they pull off 2 wins, and then you have to go to Evansville. Evansville's sitting at 5-1. Many people had them picked 9th or 10th in the conference, and they've got you coming into their place at 5-1. Again, you don't want to play a confident team, a team that's red hot. At their place. It's easier to suck the life out of them when you're at home, like you mentioned.
Right.
And I agree with you. I mean, we've got, I think, 3 solid teams that could – I'd say 2 teams can win a tournament game. I'm not completely sold on Drake because their style of play, especially when you're talking about the tournament and a Valley team getting in, they probably won't be that high of a seed to where they'll have better athletes, better scores. They'll probably have about the same, and the other team will probably have better athletes. So I don't know if that necessarily translates the best for the tournament, but I think the Valley still has right now 3 solid teams, and like you mentioned, some wild cards, and some teams that it could even possibly turn it around.
Yeah, I just think at the end of the day, you're going to look back and say, man, that win against Evansville or that win at Valpo is going to be more. And I think this is kind of the same every year, but I think this year, especially with the 2 back-to-back games, kind of like you mentioned, like there's going to be some teams that are tougher outs than you think. So I don't know. I think the Valley. I think the Valley's in a good spot this year, even with everything going on. Yeah, I think Bradley has a chance to their schedule sets up nicely. They have a chance to be sitting really nice at the end of the year. But I think it's going to come down. It's still going to come down to St. Louis, like it usually does. It's going to come down to St. Louis, and just kind of like we talked about the college football playoff too. Like that 1 seed, I think is going to be important because you get the 2 or 3 seed. You're probably going to have to play Drake or Loyola in the semifinals, whereas you get the 1 seed. Maybe you play an Indiana State or an Evansville who got hot as the 4 or 5 seed, for example. So I think that's the biggest thing is getting that 1 seed, because I think after the top 3 teams, there's a drop off.
Yeah, I agree. I think avoiding that 2-3 matchup, and I think we've said this the last couple of years, avoiding the 2-3 matchup. And I know last year, I think Bradley was the 4, and we were saying we have to avoid the 4. We got to get to 2-3. So it always seems like we're trying to avoid some type of matchup. But then again, you go down to St. Louis and you never know what's going to happen.
I mean, anything can happen down there, but I know last year talking with some of my other friends, like our thing when we're in St. Louis is you want to avoid the 3. You want to avoid the 3 because you play the late game on Monday, but you have all day to sit around. You play the late game, But then if you are to win, you have less than 24 hours to play your next game. You were to win that game, you have less than 24 hours to play that next game. So you want to be the 1, 2, or 4 or 5. And I remember right after we lost to Loyola last year and realized we were getting the 4 seed, we were actually happy with that. Like speaking about, some of my other manager friends that I know, because the two biggest reasons are, number one, you play earlier in the day, and we wanted to play UNI, but you play earlier in the day. Number two is every single game you play is about the same time. You play at I think it's 1:30 on the first day, 1 o'clock on the second day, 1 o'clock or 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock on championship Sunday. So it's the same schedule every day. And that's what we loved was we played our game on Friday, go back to the hotel, everyone showers, cleans up, whatever, you eat dinner, you do film, you get up, you do your walkthrough and film, eat lunch, go to the game. And it's the exact same schedule the next day. And I think that mindset and that routine is so important, because otherwise, you're the 3 seed, you play way late at night, you get back to the hotel, you eat dinner, you probably don't have time to go through the scout that night because it's already 11:30 midnight. You get up the next morning at 9 a.m. because you now play at 5 p.m. or whatever it is. So now you have 10 hours. Now you have 6 hours to learn to do the scout and everything. And it's so tough because you have less time every day to do things. But I agree with you. I think if I'm Bradley, or if I'm any team, I want the 1, the 2, the 4, or the 5 seed. I would rather, if I'm a team, I'd rather lose the last game of the year like Bradley did last year and get the 4 seed than get the 3 seed, just because that scheduling and that routine is so hard as a 3 seed to play 3 games in less than 24 hours each day.
Yeah, and not only that, I think this year, missing the 2-3 game would be huge too, because I think the 2-3 game is probably going to be a grinded out kind of game. Whereas maybe, if what we think happens comes true, then the drop off between 4 and the top 3, there's a bit of a difference. That 1-4 game, you can just kind of cruise through and then get the championship game instead of grinding out a game and then having to grind out another game. So I think it could be huge. And, if Bradley ends up in the situation, like you said, maybe take the 4 seed again. So it should be interesting. We're still at the beginning of the Valley season and still have a lot to learn. Some teams playing 2 games, some teams playing 4 games, some teams playing no games like our Bradley Braves, but still got a lot to learn, and we hope you guys stick with us as we learn about these Valley teams. And we'll get in more depth later on about the whole of college basketball.